Bonjour. It's my great pleasure to be here this morning. And in starting, I'd like to thank Marie Jose and her colleagues here at CIP for giving me the opportunity to spend a day and a half with all of you. I must say that this has been a great learning experience for me, in the sense that my understanding of diversity and its impact on the construction and the design of policies and their implications for practice has been greatly enhanced by all the amazing work that you all are doing. I commend you, and I thank you very much for welcoming me into your midst for a little bit of time. So thank you very much. Now, we, over the last little bit of time, have spent a lot of effort talking about policy and some effort talking about practice. Now, in the United States, where I'm from, oftentimes people talk about the impact of whatever it is, this or that, on policy and practice, as though policy and practice are more or less the same thing, or exist at two ends of a continuum. I take the position that policy is one form of activity that is important but distinct from understanding practice. Policy, I think, represents and holds our aspirations for the world. Practice, on the other, is where, as we say in the United States, where the rubber meets the road to bring our dreams to reality or not. So I want to spend some time talking with you about practice. Now, we've spent time here talking about it. I think that encapsulated in Mr. Ndoye's dimension 2, his quality dimension, was largely about what I want to refer to as practice. And Mr. Australia's talked about designing smart policies, smart reforms. Maybe a way to see what I'm talking about for the next little bit of time is one dimension about what it means to try to engage in smart reform making and smart reform execution. Now, the thing I want to refer to as practice is not just one thing, but a bundle of stuff that forms a system of practice. Now, this guy, Atul Gawande, who is a physician, some of you may have heard of him or read his work. He's a public health scholar and a physician at the Harvard School of Public Health and Harvard Medical School. He says that making systems work in healthcare, social welfare, education is the great task of my generation and your generation of clinicians and scientists. So he's saying here that taking the things that we call policy and bringing them alive in practice and systems of practice is the great challenge of our generation. And it's important that he says the great challenge of clinicians and scientists. Clinicians, many of the people we talk about a lot in a meeting like this, teachers, are at the end of the day pedagogical technicians, clinicians. And those of us in the academy and in research centers, I think one of our primary jobs is to be in support of their work every day. So our job, I think, one way to see our job, is to be the handmaidens, scientists, designers, or the handmaidens to clinical practice. We are the handmaidens of clinical practice to make systems work. And here, a system in my language is an interdependent group of tools, materials, people, and processes which join together to accomplish work. All kinds of work. You can have a system as simple as that, which you work, many of you who have young children. There's a system that happens in your house every day to get kids off to school. There's a system of practice that makes schools run, and systems of practices that do other tasks like make nuclear power plants run. But at the end of the day, all work is process, and process is an ensemble of materials, people, and tools to get work done. And what I'd like to do in the next 30 minutes or so is probe that ensemble and try to understand what it means to interrupt it to improve it. One more quote. A medical educator, his name is Paul Batalden, says that every system is perfectly designed to achieve the results it gets. Read it again. Every system is perfectly designed to achieve the results it gets. So we have optimized systems to produce the results we see. And the emphasis that I want to add is that we have done that. They didn't do it. We together did it. We are a part of these systems, and it is us working in concert that will interrupt them. So, what have these systems done? You could pick any popular periodical in the United States, and you could follow it for some number of weeks or months. And if you do, you'll come across stories like these that tell you that 80% of lower income youth in 4th grade don't read as well as we'd like them to. You could find out, and I wouldn't be surprised if the same thing happens here in Europe and in other places, that you could find out that there's a growing gap in performance between higher income families and the children of lower income families. We at the foundation refer to this as predictable failure. Why is it predictable failure? Because we have set the preconditions here for those children of 2019, for 20, 30 years hence, to be the people who will not be able to participate productively in higher education, in the work life of our cultures. So these are failures that if we sit here today and pay attention to numbers like these, we can predict those failures in the future. And our task is to interrupt today's system so that that doesn't happen. And when we are faced with problems like these, what do we do as educators? We design stuff. We design new policies, we design new programs, we design new technologies. And every attempt to do that is an attempt to interrupt systems of practice. I'll tell you a little story highlighted here. About 10 years ago, in the city of Birmingham in Alabama in the United States, they began a program of what we refer to, and maybe you do as well, as one-to-one computing, where every kid, in this case, in elementary school in that city, received a laptop. He received an XO laptop, at the time one of the products of the MIT lab at the MIT University. Here, you see two headlines that appeared about this one-to-one program in Birmingham newspapers about 18 months in. So they say most Birmingham classrooms are not using the laptops much, but supporters urge not giving up on them. Another headline, XO laptops are well received by teachers and students, but use is limited. Inside these headlines lie two truths. First truth, this is a good idea. It was a way to personalize, differentiate, help teachers become producers of knowledge, come up with new assessments, ... Also, students took great joy in the work with these things. There was a new sense of ownership, creative productions using programs like Scratch, new tools for scientific investigation. Really good stuff, so good ideas. But also, poorly executed. So, less than hoped for use. Applications to the core aspects of schooling was less than expected. They found that teachers were underprepared. There was a real press on the technical infrastructure in that city such that they couldn't support all those computers. And perhaps the biggest bottom line is that the poorest students were least well served by this innovation. And the key is, without what we heard, what Mr. Estrella suggested, without smart planning for implementation, we most often recreate the conditions of bias that we have. And lest you think that this is a one-time thing, each of these, Sesame Street, when it was first introduced in the United States, was designed to be a program to help the families of poor children. But initially, it was most used by the families of the middle class. Initial evaluations of the Khan Academy suggest underuse in the poorest communities. A lot of ideas like this are encapsulated in a book by a colleague of ours that's called Stuck in the Shallow End. So these are not, the Birmingham experience, as we say in the United States, was not a unique train wreck. This happens a lot with new innovations. And the reason I think it does happen is that we underappreciate that we're bringing new bundles of practice to old situations and we don't plan well enough for them. One final point about this, and points to the need for a more focused science of improvement. Here you see in the first column a bunch of medical clinical procedures, flu vaccination, down to diabetic foot care. In the second column, what you see is the year of the landmark trial, usually an experiment, that demonstrated that that thing held important promise. And as of the year 2000, what you see in the third column is the percentage of use of that innovation in the United States. What does this mean? We know from the second column that we know that this is important, but the third column tells us how difficult it is to get these things into practice. So knowing that something is valuable is not the same as knowing how to do it. So getting ideas into action, tough problem. And at the core of that problem, I'd like to argue, is getting inside the black box of everyday practice. And inside the black box of everyday practice are the differences we see because of context, something we've heard a lot about in this meeting, how belief changes across localities, and how values are different in different places. And in order to get ideas reliably into action, we have to understand how to contend with making practice sensitive to this level of variation. Short of that, education has a learning problem. I got a little bit of translation issues here with my slides, I apologize. And I think at the core of our learning problem is our attempt to fill two gaps. And every innovation, I think, has both of these gaps at play. The first is the awareness gap. You need mechanisms and procedures and methods to identify quality ideas, to assess the promise of those ideas. This is the what of improvement. And we have many, many good tools to help us understand the what. We have sophisticated experimental methods. We have, we have ways to build policies around important what's. But there's another gap. It's called the knowing-doing gap. And I might argue, as Jeff Pfeffer and Bob Sutton have in their book, that the knowing-doing gap is as important as the awareness gap. So in the knowing-doing gap, we wonder how innovations change by context. We worry extensively about clinical execution. So because you have some great innovation, clinicians will ask you, well, what do I do next? Clinicians will ask you, given this innovation, what's necessary, what's optional? These are the how of improvement. And these, I argue, we have underdeveloped mechanisms for their exploration. And the key to fulfilling the great promise of our generation, as Gwande talked about it, the key to that is understanding better how to have methods and practices that allow scholars on the one hand and practitioners on the other to reliably fill the knowing-doing gap. So the knowing-doing gap, I think, when it comes to interrupting systems of practice, is where the action is. Now, I'll give an example from our own work to sort of help you see what I think of as the collection of difficulties and the force of the knowing-doing gap. So in, I think, 2008, my colleague Tony Brink and colleagues produced this book called Organizing Schools for Improvement. A way, if you've read this book, it's a great book. If you've read this book, you'll see that what they do in this book is outline in great detail the what of school change. They looked at a collection of schools in Chicago, a large collection, and some schools in their report moved, that is, got better, and other schools stagnated. And in the book, they talk about the characteristics of the ones that moved versus the characteristics of those that did not. More recently, we published this book, Learning to Improve, How American Schools Can Get Better at Getting Better. In this book, we try to talk about the kinds of things, the kind of methods you can have in place to take the what of reform and translate it into the how of action. So in the Organizing Schools for Improvement book, they get inside the black box of practice. They talk about the technical core of instruction. They talk about how time is used in schools, both effectively and ineffectively. They talk about the effective provision of supplemental services like services for special education, services for students who are advanced. They crawl inside in great gory detail the black box of instruction. They try to understand the dynamics of student motivation. They try to understand how you make sure that the kids who need to be in certain instructional places are there. So they talk about the importance of attendance and other things like that. And then they say that taking advantage and improving the technical core of instruction relies on 5 essential supports for student learning. The first is managing instructional core, having aligned materials, and so forth. The second is building professional capacity for teachers and others to execute in the technical core. The third is bringing the community into the school, bringing parents and others, make sure that those people are tied to things like ensuring attendance and things like that. The fourth is making sure inside the school there's a positive climate for instruction. The fifth is leadership, both leadership in the principalship, but also distributed leadership, taken together, they argue, that those things, those 5 essential supports, will enhance student learning and engagement. Now, the point I want to make is if you talk to almost any clinician and you say, well, you know, one of the 5 essential supports is parent, school, and community ties. A clinician will turn to you and say, well, okay, I believe that, but how do I do it? What are the steps that I have to go through in order to establish that? Or if you're a leader, you might ask, well, how do I build professional capacity? We were once sitting in a meeting, my colleagues and I, and a teacher was talking about, a senior teacher was talking about how she talks about how she expresses affection for students who are struggling, what she does to bring them into the environment of the classroom. A new teacher was listening to her talk about that, and she whispered to her colleague, I want to know how to do that. So it's important to know that veteran teachers bring students into the family of the classroom. It is equally important for leadership to specify to new teachers how that is accomplished. So in our Learning to Improve book, we talk about 6 essential principles that we think begin to allow us to crawl inside the how. And the first is to organize as networks. So both networks within schools, but networks across schools. The second is being problem-centered and user-centered. So when we've looked at groups of networks of people trying to solve problems, perhaps the single biggest reason they fail to achieve and often fall apart is that the people in the group don't have a solid and shared definition about what they're trying to do. So they have a general sense, but detailed specification of what the problem is and how we're going to do it is often absent. Attend to variability and see the system. The Birmingham story I told you is really a story of variability. Some schools in Birmingham did a great job with these computers. Other schools in Birmingham did not. Often in our business, when we talk about effects like these, we really concentrate on reporting the average effects. The message, I think, is that we have to attend to the variability across contexts and help us understand what the variability is telling us. Second, we have to understand the system, the elements that are producing the effects we see. Next, we have to embrace measurement because, as we say in that book, you can't improve what you can't measure. And so you have to have measurement systems that focus on process. And the processes you focus on have to be shared processes. So we learn, as we say here, through disciplined inquiry. Collections of people have to share common processes. And sharing common processes means that we have a common language of reform, we can communicate about results, so we have to have a set of things that we do together. And when we do these things, we advance not just individual learning, but we advance social learning, and it's the advancement of social learning that leads to organizational improvement. So in the time I have remaining, what I'd like to do is take this general assemblage of ideas and show you a little piece of its action inside a school in Los Angeles called the UCLA Community School. The UCLA Community School is a school that is co-operated by my institution, our institution, UCLA, and the Los Angeles Public School District. So it's a Los Angeles public school, but it's co-run by our university with LA Unified. That school has as its North Star that UCLA CS students will graduate entering the adult world as confident and capable human beings prepared to succeed in college and pursue meaningful careers and participate in our democracy. That is the North Star that their leadership has worked very hard to get the entire school community to agree on. One way that that North Star becomes an aim is that 95% of all seniors will become college ready by the time they graduate. They together built a school-wide theory of improvement to try to reach an aim like that. And their school-wide theory had 5 primary drivers: systematic learning supports, personalized learning and personalization and learner-centeredness, rigorous integrated curriculum, bilingual and multicultural instruction. A word about this is that the UCLA Community School is in a region of Los Angeles called Little Koreatown. And so about half the students are Latino, a quarter are Korean, and the remaining students are a mixture of ethnicities throughout LA. So being multicultural is extremely important in that school, and to have and to take a social justice perspective on learning. So their challenge was to take their general theory and to have each teacher and part of the school talk about what our team's improvement story is given the theory of improvement. So one region of the school might say, the way that we're going to reach this goal, our big theory, is we're going to improve literacy. So in each region of the school is organized into an upper school, a lower school. The lower school has primary grades, it's organized in dens, and the upper school, the high school, is organized in academic departments. And the essence of this approach was that everyone had to specify what their problem was, each team's problem, and what is your theory of improvement, and talk about how that theory of improvement aligns with the big theory of improvement. So, for example, in the math department, we want to communicate math knowledge and its use in varied forms and help students understand how to represent that knowledge. So when you talk to teachers about this, they say things like, I'd say every process is difficult, but this is the first process I've seen that starts from the bottom up. Everything else is top down. At its core, they focused on leadership, professional learning, and processes for improvement. In their leadership focus, they focused on data collection and analysis, but not the delivery of data, the ownership and the production of data by frontline staff. They focused on infrastructures for learning, so ways that staff could talk to one another about what they're learning about the data. And leadership took the task of making sure that there was a professional vision shared across the school. So in professional learning, teachers were responsible for collecting data about their practice and sharing that data, for example. With respect to the processes of improvement, the staff took the original driver diagram, which you see up on the left, and extending it to the right for specific processes. They shared things like what we call causal systems analysis, this fishbone diagram here. They had a common set of improvement processes that they shared through the school. Oh, I'm missing a slide, but that's okay. So what you see here is a principal, one of the teachers, going over a set of processes in their theory with respect to the goal they're working on. We want 70% of our students in 4 cohorts, grade 4 through 8, to read at a grade level in English by June of 2016. So this is the sort of detailed work that leadership does with teachers in order to work through theory. So learning to improve involves not what we normally think about, that people start with a goal and they march orderly to that goal. Learning to improve is a messy process, fraught with failure and you make one step forward, one step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but it really looks like this. when you're engaged in a process like this, people in the organization say it helps us to learn, it helps us to organize ourselves better. It improved our communication. We're working on the same thing, and it's a common thing for all of us. This work in this school started in 2013 on a small credit recovery project. It moved to work using these PDSA cycles, which are really just little experiments, to the science department. In 2014, these small experiments became a management tool for the whole school. And in 2016-17, it was the leadership that started to do little experiments on their practice. So it's a journey that started in 2012, and it continues today. So summing up, in doing work like this, you have to expect variation. Without attention to variation, innovations will reproduce inequity. You have to embrace failure as a way to learn. And you have to understand that inequity lives in the details of execution of practice. And engineering equity is possible through radical attention to process. So the challenge going forward, I would argue, not just for that school, but for our work and maybe all of our work, is to extend the democratic franchise into innovation. And by that I mean we want a broadly catalyzed voice. We want to appreciate context, and we want to extend the proportion of people locally who can participate in decision making. Equity in access, opportunity, and outcome is both aspirational policy and engineering of detailed practice. So at the end of the day, is that we have to have both a robust science of policy and a robust science of practice is the message I'd like to leave you. So thank you very much.